of delve into a modeling exercise that's really designed to do several things. And it's really sort of surrounding this idea of co-production and looking to see what this model can do for us as managers and what we can do for modelers to help them to focus on things and phenomenon that we're interested in. However, we're going to first start with a further introduction to the Pinelands ecosystem, the fire dynamics and fire effects in this system. We're going to use the Spring Hill fire as sort of our test area or our model forest for the simulations that are going to be happening this afternoon that you're going to see. And it's going to really form the basis of all of those modeling activities. So we're going to start with a little bit of an overview of that and general fire ecology, and then we're going to delve into the computational fluid dynamics modeling, what it is, how it can help us move forward, and how it can forward our thinking as managers in the future, even if it's on a conceptual basis. One of the things that we kind of talked about within our group, for instance, is how do we as managers look at fuels? How do we measure fuels? And then how do those fit into a model like this? And I think that there's probably a little bit of a disjunct in maybe the typical thinking that a manager might make and what we actually need to populate a model like this with fuels. And I really think it's kind of cool, and it might help us to better our conceptualization in our own brains as to how it might fit into that model and think about how we treat it as we're burning. I think it just sort of understanding that structure and what it's doing to fire dynamics. So it's a pretty cool conversation that we can have. So we'll get a little bit into that modeling with Rod, and then we're gonna dig into this concept of co-production some more. And Kevin is going to talk more about the modeling exercises that have been going on in the past and how we can sort of bring those into what we're doing this afternoon. We're going to go back to Tom Gerber with a little bit of an assist from Mike Gallagher, and he's going to set the stage for the day by talking about the Spring Hill wildfire, the ecology of the area, and some of the suppression tactics that surround that incident. And even though this was a fire incident, I think that you'll see in our modeling exercises this afternoon that there were pre-management strategies that could have been taken to mitigate the circumstances of the fire. And so while we're starting off with a wildfire event, I'd like to have you keep in mind sort of what kind of fuel treatments might have been done before the fire started that might have been a pre-suppression strategy. How could we have maybe widened fuel breaks and things of that nature? So keep that in the back of your head, even though this is a wildfire scenario that Tom's going to be talking about. Without any more, off to you, Gallagher and Gerber.
So good morning, everybody. I'm Tom Gerber, and I'm a fire manager with the New Jersey Forest Fire Service. And we're going to be talking about the Spring Hill wildfire, so named for the area of the Pine Plains called Spring Hill, which is wedged between the east and west plains, which is about 150,000 acre fireshed in the dwarf pine region of South Jersey. So the Spring Hill fire was born on a class 5 day in mid-March 2019, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. All the fire towers picked up the smoke down in that area. There were about 8 fire towers that picked up the smoke and were triangulating. Said the fire was in the Spring Hill region. It's an area that's known for a lot of parties and stuff like that. And most likely the fire was the result of one of these bonfire parties. So class 5 day sets the stage. It's wind blowing out of the south, 20 miles an hour, relative humidity below 30%, air temperature up in the 70s. So in probably 2 weeks since we'd had substantial rain, we had done a lot of control burning prior to this fire. It was pretty much known to everybody, this area, the West Plains, hadn't seen a significant fire since 1946. So it was primed and ready to go on that afternoon. I had received the call. The area didn't have a full-time warden assigned to it at the time, so we were kind of sharing coverage. A fellow named Trevor Rayner, a co-worker, fire manager, was going to assume the role as IC on this Spring Hill fire. We knew it was pretty much off to the races by the way the towers were describing the heavy black smoke column, and it was an area where the Spring Hill area was kind of where it started on Spring Hill was true dwarf pines. Hadn't really gotten out of that 20-foot height limit there. It was pretty, down below that, and very dense and ready to go. Yeah, it was lower, and yeah, so driven by the south wind, we knew it had, several acres out in front of it. I consulted with the IC. I was going to assume a role as a division supervisor with IC Trevor Rayner, and I told him, after 40 years experience of handling many major fires, I said, make sure you have a pretty big box for this fire. We're looking at something that has the potential to burn 20,000 acres or more. So he agreed with that consultation, and we said we were going to make the effort to stop the fire to the south of Route 72, which is a major highway artery bisecting the Jersey Shore. So we got the highway closed down. We had the helicopter doing surveillance to make sure there were no pedestrians or anybody out in the woods hiking. So they did a surveillance with a helicopter. And at that point, consulting with the IC, and Scott Nauer was going to be the ops chief, I instructed them that our best course of action was to anchor into our facility at Coyle Field, which is a large break in the forest. And we had the highway. We were going to anchor into the highway, and we were going to start firing to the north on Route 72 and make every effort to hold the fire south of 72. If the fire didn't hold on 72 and it spotted across, it would be off to the races, would have the potential to burn 50 or more thousand acres and affect a large interface area in Ocean County. So we were definitely not looking for that to happen. So a lot of good effort was put into this backfire operation all throughout 72. Go ahead.
So I was actually out, we're talking about co-production throughout this, and I was out not too far away doing some forest effects plots in the next management forest over when this fire began. And to get an idea of what the conditions were like, I think I got to the fire about 12 to 15 minutes after the towers had crossed it. And the first engine came out and met me and another a fire warden on the road. And the fire was about 50 acres at that point, 25 to 50 acres. This was a very fast moving fire. And as you'll see in some maps, as you do the exercises with QUIC-Fire, that fire was positioned on a ramp to just take off with a south wind along what was this expanse of very volatile pines. Yeah, then as Tom said, there's a burnout operation, and I worked with Tom for much of the afternoon there on that plan. And this image right here is looking down the road at the head fire coming, heading north. And so you can see what the fuels kind of looked like in that area. Those trees are, hardly the size of the truck. Some are a little bit bigger. And this was, we'd started the backing fire operation, and we're getting an idea of where things sat looking down the road.
So I'm going to get just into the backfire operation and try to explain that to everybody, how this kind of works in this Jersey Pine Barrens. So many years ago, one of the older fire managers, a fellow by the name of Bill Haggerty, had gave me instruction on how to do blowhole firing, and I had practiced that many times. I'd probably used it successfully on 15 or more major fires throughout the pines. And so when we start a backfire operation along a break such as Route 72 or something, you do strip firing along the road, and you have either firing off of a vehicle or the the personnel are actually lighting. And very often in these dwarf pine areas and all, the fire just does not back up fast enough. So you can get, a spotting zone where you can have hot embers drop in and not cross into the unburned fuel that you're trying to keep it from. So you strip fire, and a lot of times that just does not get in far enough to stop the heading fire. So this blowhole technique, which Mr. Haggerty had perfected over the years, he had learned it from some of the older wardens who had been around during the 30s and 40s fires. And you would anchor into a safe spot, such as your barrier, and you would actually take fire on angles, chevron angles, you line up towards the head fire, and keeping an eye on the smoke conditions of the head fire. You would take that in on these angles, leaving yourself a safe area to retreat to, burned area, and you would repeat this chevron pattern of blowhole firing. So we've gotten pretty good at doing that. We'd had the Butler Place fire a few years before, and several other fire managers who had worked with me on perfecting that technique. We were doing that on this fire, and it was working. We would take a little chunk of fire at a time. We would come to a break of a sand road or a road leading into an area that was called the Omni, which regulates all the air traffic on the East Coast. Where we had a facility there, we had to protect. So we would drag fire on these angles, keep working it, and a lot of the fellows and gals that were using the torches, the Cranko torches with me, were in constant communication. And we got this fire to actually go in the direction we wanted to. It kind of defies logic and wind to some degree, but it's a technique that you'll see more in the modeling. That this is very valuable, and we had the ability to get the fire in several hundred yards off of Route 72, which allowed the few spot fires that did jump the highway were picked up readily with brush trucks and the helicopter.
So the road that you're looking down right here is Route 72, and that'll come up in the modeling. Just to take a look back, this is one of the best roads in the whole burn unit. If you look at this sand road, it is one of the widest roads. There's lots of roads that went through the area, and most of them were in reality about half as wide as this one, with the tree canopies almost connecting, if not connecting, because it's not a very traveled area. So none of those existing roads throughout that area were feasible fuel breaks. They almost might as well not have been there. And even this highway right here, Tom can attest that there have been numerous fires in his career that have crossed a road like that as though it wasn't even there.
So it should be noted as well. We had the break of our Coil Field facility, which is a 1,000-acre property. A lot of that's been cleared for runways and landing helicopters and all. So that was good to have that break to the east. And also, one of my coworkers, fellow Warden Scott Nauer, had done a 100-acre control burn on the north side of 72. So I knew that we had that as a little bit of a breathing room as we proceeded north on 72. With the firing operation, our box we were looking at was probably a 20,000-acre box. We ended up being able to scale that down to about 11,000 acres. A handful of spot fires, none of which exceeded the diameter of one of our brush trucks. So really impressive work by all of the New Jersey Forest Fire crews, our Air Force, really, and a classic bad spring fire day. I mean, typically, they occur, the real bad days are in April. This was still in March, but it was an impressive piece of work by everybody, all the cooperators.
So this picture is clearly out on the highway there after the backfire had been established for quite a while. And I would say with the highway and then maybe, I would say maybe 200 feet in of backfire, you know, the head fire came out in about 2 main waves. And there were spots, not horrendous spots, but there were spots across the road that we then initial attacked. And the fuel on the opposite side of the road was very similar to what had been burning. So I would say there were probably 24 spots that ended up getting put out. And those spot fires, the farthest one was probably, I would say, 300 or 400 feet into the green on the other side of the road. And then all along the road, there were numerous spot fires. So just considering the value of that break, but also the importance of not being too comfortable with it, you know, there was still work to do. One interesting thing about this fire as well, you know, this whole area burned in the better part of one operational period, what we would call one operational period on a U.S. Forest Service like large incident. The fire behavior, I'm not sure if this picture quite does it justice, but through the night, the burnout operation continued, and with 70% humidity, you know, in that evening, there was still plenty of wind. You know, Tom can probably describe fire behavior in the evening better.
Yeah, we had a lot of firing operations going on around. There were a couple 100-acre valuable tree plantings on private property that needed to be fired around. There were several hunting cabins that were really just tucked in the middle of nowhere, and in this dense fuel that, like I say, for the most part, hadn't seen fire since 1946. And the fire just continued. I think we actually had it tied in by 6 o'clock in the morning. The fire started at 2 in the afternoon. So it was just nonstop work by about 50 employees that really just, you know, kept things moving. The fire behavior in the evening was incredible. I mean, it was just, it would chew through thousands of acres in a matter of minutes. It was just incredible. So, like I said, Mike said, 70% humidity. Typically, we get a little more comfortable 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, but the fire showed absolutely no signs of you know, wanting to calm down, even at that late hour. So it was pretty incredible.
So this is just an aerial image looking down, kind of from over top of Coyle Field, looking south at the extent of the burned area. And the effects of this fire created some interesting street trees, or tree streets rather, and some interesting patterns in fire effects. You can see some of those sand roads now are far more exposed than they were previously, winding through the pine plains. This is an example of one of the more severely burned areas in the extent of the fire. We actually have a research plot there now. And in the background, you can see one of those tree streets that wasn't burned quite as severely. I'd like to skip back and, well, before that, just note the differences in fuel structure here on the right. So the picture on the top right is a bit what the fuel that hasn't been managed might look like. This image was taken in an area that's been fire excluded for about 80 years or so. And the image on the bottom right was collected in an area that's been annually burned for probably close to 80 years. And you can see a major difference in fuel structure where the canopy starts to get out of the surface fuels with that repeated burning. And that's something that there's not such an opportunity for around the Spring Hill area because the trees and shrubs are so closely connected, and genetically those trees are different such that they will not grow to the height of a typical mature tree. So what's made that always a volatile fuel is the fact that the litter layer and the shrub layer and the canopy layers are so inseparable that it leads to just these intense wildfires.
Yeah, and I think it should also be noted that this Pine Plains area, the West East Plains and the Spring Hill area, since 1926, which drives our decision making on a lot of these fires, since 1926, 12 firefighters have given their lives fighting fires in these dwarf pine areas. So it's on everybody's mind when there's a smoke sighting in this area. And, you know, being one of the more seasoned wardens, it's always on my mind to pass that information along to our next generation of fire managers.
I'd like to skip back and look at some other examples of the Pine Barrens as well. So this is an example of maybe a more mature forest that has not been managed or had very recent wildfire through it. And you could see a lot of ladder fuels there, very dense surface fuels. This is an example of an area that has been burned more regularly with a lower intensity prescribed fire. And opening up that forest structure really allows much more airflow for fuels to dry during the time of year when we prescribe burn. Tom mentioned that the backing fire really didn't get in very far without substantial help from some aggressive firing techniques. And I believe in part that was because the forest itself hindered the wind movement so much going through it. If you think with the head fire, everything behind the head fire was burnt out. And so there was no more obstruction in the forest for that wind. But where the backing fire was really obstructed by that dense material there. Here's an example of a more intense prescribed fire, and wardens like Tom use a variety of prescribed fire techniques and characteristics to achieve different fuel reduction goals. Here's another example of an area, and you can see even just over a couple meters, there can be some pretty profound differences in fire effects that relate to the fire behavior. So in this area, the wind baffled twice and created these little islands or linear features of less burnt fuel during that prescribed fire. Another important thing that we touched on yesterday to remember, though, is also that these fuels vegetatively regenerate quite rapidly. And so they mentioned yesterday the epicormic buds that are on pitch pines, and not every pine or tree species has this adaptation. But pitch pine will regrow true branches starting with sprouts of needles, and they'll sprout out of any stem material really, and eventually the tree will recover new true branches. And if the stem does die, they're quite effective at regenerating from root sprouts. And so what's really kind of neat is the Pine Plains was studied by Cy Little back in the 50s to try to determine the age of the trees. And those trees, many of them are 150 to 250 years old and have sprouted numerous times after being top killed in wildfires. And at the time, Cy Little had estimated that they had resprouted and regrown from sprouts about every 8 years prior to the 1950s. So just to get an idea of how this forest regenerates and is a constant, something that needs constant attention. Here's a slightly more normal structured forest that's in the process of being prescribed burned that had been excluded for a while. And so there's an importance sometimes of multiple fires and changing that structure as well to give a better management opportunity in the case of a wildfire. This, I think, is my last slide here, and it shows that there was a pretty severe wildfire that went through an area in Tom's section in 2014 called the Springer's Brook Fire. And so this had not been prescribed burned recently prior to the fire, but was quite severe fire conditions. And you can see some epicormic sprouting on the trees there, and some change in structure. I think we could take some questions now, if there are any.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mike and Tom. We did have a question come into the chat window, and again, I encourage folks to type your questions as you have them. John was asking, was the foliar live moisture, let me try again. Was the foliar live fuel moisture of the conifers known? Some very early in the growing season, or seems very early in the growing season for a crown fire. In Wisconsin, a trigger point for crown fire is 100% live foliar moisture and a dropping throughout the quote spring dip.
Yeah, I could answer that. So we were calculating that for a while. There's a pretty consistent trend in how that pans out in the pine barrens. And it's actually pretty interesting that the pygmy pines or the pine plains trees there actually have a consistently lower live fuel moisture than the rest of the pines. They're about 10% less. So during the spring dip period of the year, which during the Spring Hill fire we were approaching, we probably actually weren't at the bottom point of the dip. The live fuel moisture for the needles is about somewhere around 85%. At the highest point in the year, which would occur sometime around June, would be probably about 180%. So there's quite a large difference there, and we were approaching that low point. We've looked at it for years, measuring it, and it's pretty consistent throughout the year how that fuel moisture trend plays out.
Thanks. Yeah, Kevin added, yes, it was, in terms of, yes, the live fuel moisture was measured, and those data were used in our simulations that will be presented in the Modeler 2 session, just in case you don't have measurements handy. So yeah, thanks for providing that context. Folks, you're welcome to type questions into the chat window. I'm sure you have them. I guess I'm sort of curious about, I don't know, fire behavior differences. You described some of it, but between the kind of the dwarf pine plains and just, you know, standard pitch pine barrens, you know, how is it different?
Well, the difference in the pine plains and pitch pine lowlands, a lot of times there's not that much difference. It's all the stocking and the density. And when we get fires, well, fires of the same magnitude as the pine plains in areas that have, you know, 60-foot tall trees that are just densely stocked in these pine lowland areas, and they'll put out tremendous flame heights.
Cool, thanks. We had another question. Casey's asking, what is the typical spotting distance from these trees? Very good question.
They'll spot upwards of a mile or more on, you know, given wind events. So it's, you know, that's not uncommon. The Salters Pitch Fire of 2008, we had spotting 1.5 miles into an area that had just burned the year before. So, you know, the distance is a lot of times wind driven by the wind.
There's a really neat video, the 360-degree video that Amanda shared prior to this, and if you hadn't gotten a chance to take a look at it, it's a neat, and this goes for everyone, it's a neat opportunity to really look at spotting. So there's a head fire approaching in that video, and there's spotting that starts probably about 50 feet out in front of it, and as the head fire gets closer, the spotting increases, and to the point where there are hundreds of embers starting spot fires right in advance, only maybe 20 meters or less in front of the head fire. On this fire, I would say the Spring Hill fire, some of the longer distance spotting was probably in the vicinity of 400 feet or more. But to also get an idea of how far particles might travel, potentially, during the last major incident like this before, the 2007 Warren Grove fire that burned about 17,000 acres, there were, one of the wardens actually showed me a mason jar of bark particles that he picked up, his girls picked up on their deck 9 miles from the fire while he was off on the fire. And so, you know, the distance that particles can travel can be quite far. And historically, there have been quarter-mile spots that have occurred in this fuel type, at least.
Oh, great, thank you. Let's see, I don't see other questions in the chat window. We are coming up on a 5-minute break. So if I see any questions before I finish talking, I'll pause and take them. But otherwise, just logistically what we're about to do, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and I encourage people to get up, stretch, use the restroom, don't check your email because we want you to come back. When we come back, then Nick and Kevin are Kevin and Rod are going to give us a closer look at QUIC-Fire, which will help set us up for this afternoon. So again, that'll be building on what you just got to see from this presentation of how the Spring Hill fire unfolded, with a deeper dive into the fuels and fire behavior and fire effects in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. We'll begin to see this in the modeling context. And then this afternoon, really deep dive. So I don't see any further questions. So I'm going to ask folks to take a 5-minute break, and we will see you. At what my clock says 11:45. I know we have folks in different time zones, so at 4:45 the top of the hour. So take 5. We'll see you in a few. Let's see.
Okay.
Recording. All right.
Awesome.
So welcome back, Kevin and Rod. Take it away.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. As we're kind of resetting for the co-production part of the workshop, Rod and I wanted to go ahead and spend a little bit of time both recapturing sort of the opportunities of these new modeling tools, the applications, and then also sort of the reason why we need you to advance them over the course of the next few hours for the workshop, and then years as we take these tools to operational applications. So without further ado, we're going to be talking a lot about QUIC-Fire. We presented some details of QUIC-Fire in a video that Southern Fire Exchange recorded that was handed out to the participants. We're going to review quickly some of that, but then do a deeper dive just really as kind of changing that mindset. I do want to point out that this entire effort started as an outgrowth of the Prescribed Fire Science Consortium. The consortium was designed really to advance prescribed fire science, and yet we've started with this wildfire. And so I think it's really important to recognize the role that the New Jersey Forest Fire Service has played in bringing us together, along with the participants and the Northeast Fire Science Exchange, to make this a reality, even though it's virtual. When we were in Missoula, Montana, having a research burn event with international participants in town for a conference, Greg McLaughlin said, we're going to do this in New Jersey because we want to change the game. We fight fire. We've got some of the worst fire, behavior potential in America, and we need to start thinking about doubling our acreage of prescribed fire. And so that vision is one of the reasons why we're here, and we're going to talk about how science and what was presented yesterday, this fantastic wealth of information that's been collected by Nick and others in New Jersey can be leveraged to apply the best new technology. For those of us managing fire, prescribed fire or wildfire in the modern landscape, we know that fire is getting increasingly complex. And the sad reality is that we need 21st century tools and technologies to help us plan and execute prescribed fires, fight fires safely, and protect the public. And yet there's no national leadership on prescribed fire right now that's creating a plan and getting tools and technologies in the hands of practitioners. We're largely at the mercy of sort of this wildfire-focused science, which is holding us back a little bit. One of the things I do want to emphasize, and the reason why we're here, is we are on the cusp of a wildland fire modeling revolution. And I don't think it's too much to overstate that. We have had physics-based fluid dynamic approaches to fire modeling for almost 20 years, and Rod will give us a brief history of that and what they provided. But right now, there's a number of tools and opportunities and approaches to taking the physics and what we've learned about that and making them practical tools. And coupled fire atmospheric behavior modeling is really going to be the catch-all term for for all of these supercomputer to operational tools that we're developing. And one of the reasons why we're so excited about it is that it takes a model of, say, prescribed fire on your screen, and it allows us to integrate all the pieces from atmospheric interactions with, fuels and fire behavior to predicting smoke and ultimately predicting fire effects, because they run on a much more detailed depiction of forests and shrublands, grasslands that we're burning. The other thing that we're going to emphasize and really ask you to dive deep with us in are looking for training opportunities. These tools, we realized early on, about maybe 7 or 8 years ago, that we were limited in using coupled fire atmospheric behavior modeling tools by our own creativity. Even some of the fastest tools, they'll take a little while to run, minutes to hours, whereas the supercomputers are, a day to 2 days. But the training tools and the applications and teaching people about critical fire behavior, like you heard from Tommy and Mike earlier, these are not the behaviors and the tactics that you hear in the books or in the fire behavior courses that were taught, nationally. These are hard-won lessons of experience, and yet we now have the tools that can capture them and unpack those tactics and local fire behaviors that we observe. So just to restate the objectives for today and the objectives for us specifically in trying to co-produce these new fire behavior modeling tools. So we're going to go through and refresh everybody's memory. What is a coupled fire atmospheric behavior model, and what's new about QUIC-Fire relative to some of the tools that we have? We're going to talk about why New Jersey is actually one of the perfect test beds for this kind of stuff. I mean, not only do we have a really active and welcoming partner in the New Jersey Forest Fire Service, we've got all of this data from the U.S. Forest Service's research program that Nick and Mike and others have provided. But we also have, amazing kind of wealth of experienced managers like Tommy that can double check and provide us feedback. And so here we are. And what do we need from you, managers and researchers, to advance these tools? Here's a list. We're going to need things like evaluating its behavior. When you enter those afternoon sessions, we want your creative thoughts. We want your, the way you might use these kinds of tools or approaches in planning, in training, in teaching scenarios. We definitely want your feedback, good or bad, on its performance and what you would like to see to have some of these tools improve. And then ultimately, we also are going to be looking for additional test sites beyond what we've done in New Jersey. So I'd like to turn it over to Rod Lynn at Los Alamos National Lab, who's going to go through some of the basics of wildland fire modeling over the past few years and thinking about this coupled fire atmospheric behavior modeling. Go ahead, Rod.
So thank you, Kevin. And I wanted to start by saying that
Rod, I think we lost you on audio for a moment. Uh-oh, Rod. I'm afraid we can't hear you. Was working before. Oh, try again. Now we got you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we got you now.
All right. So a lot of the basic building blocks that control fire behavior are understood, but the key is that there's still a big set of challenges that are in how do we anticipate how all those small building blocks are going to work together. As you can see from the diagram on the left, there's a whole bunch of interacting processes, various heat transfer, fluid dynamics, turbulence, as well as the combustion processes themselves, which any combustion expert is going to tell you that combusting biomass by itself is really complex. So we've got all these interacting things that affect each other. And the crux is, how do we capture the essence of what's happening there at these fine scales, even fuel particle scales, up to landscape levels. So next slide. So there's a set of challenges that really make this problem difficult. And this is true for wildland fire, but it's especially true for prescribed fire. The range of important length scales. This is taking things from the weather scales all the way down to the fuel scales and the heterogeneity of the fuel. If you've got bunch grass with spaces between the bunches. This is important when you come to low intensity prescribed fires, or what we sometimes hope are low intensity prescribed fires, I should say. So there's a wide range of highly coupled processes that interact with each other and affect each other. And this makes it really challenging because we can't just isolate one of them and study that single one in the lab and then think we know the problem, because they're all influencing each other. The dynamics and heterogeneity of the forests, like you've just heard over the past hour, is also really important. How do the winds change with time? And the fact that they change in magnitude and direction is really important. And so we can't just use a steady state model. We can't just assume that the fuels are a continuous fuel bed. Those spaces between trees, or the spaces between the trees and the understory, are really important. And in terms of understanding how well our models are doing, this is a really, really difficult environment to characterize through observations. And so when we talk about validation, a lot of that's going to come back to co-production. The managers that have been in the field for years know the fire behavior better than any of the data shows right now. So incorporating that into what, as we go forward and developing these models, is critical. Next slide. So I want to throw just a frame of mind out there for people to think about, and this is especially true for the really detailed physics-based wildfire models and the ones that run on supercomputers, and so just to think about them in the context of observations. So observations, whether they're in fields or in a laboratory, those are full physics. Those are the real thing, right? Something's burning, you're watching whatever it's burning. There's no approximations there. Whatever you're seeing is the truth. However, it's really hard to dissect that and pick apart the pieces. If you're watching a wildfire in the landscape, it's really hard to know what the velocities are inside that fire or what the combustion environment really looks like. So we say they're complete physics, but only partially disclosed. Models, on the other hand, are only partial physics. We're doing our best to capture what's going on based on our understanding and based on the limitations of the computing power, but it's only partially disclosed because there's still a limit to how fine we can get and how much we can represent the fuel. So when we think about modeling and observations, they need to be put together. And this is where co-production becomes a really, really valuable thing to think about going forward. So models can be used to test our understanding, develop new hypotheses about why things are happening and test those hypotheses, to develop scenarios and sensitivities through explorations. It's always important to keep in mind what model you're using and what the assumptions and approximations are that sit underneath that model. And probably the crux of what we're talking about today is how you take some of those really complicated models and turn them into something that can support operations. Next slide. So Nick talked about this just briefly, and so I wanted to back up and mention it again. We're dealing with something where we're discretizing or breaking the space that a fire exists in into a bunch of cells, a bunch of small volumes. And in those volumes, we need to think about what is the fuel in those volumes and what are the processes in those volumes that are going on during the fire. So we use the word explicitly resolved to mean things that we capture outright in the models. And those are things, influences of topography, influences of the fuel structure on the wind field, the large scale effects of the buoyancy you'll hear a lot about this afternoon and see some of the effects on both fire behavior and smoke. But then there's also things that are smaller than those grid cells, right? The flow around pine needles, for instance. We're not going to get to where we're simulating that explicitly, especially in an operational tool. The the details of the combustion processes. We're having to do some creative modeling to capture that and make sure it has the right sensitivities to the environment. So next slide. So for the fuels description, just so that you understand what's going into these models, we're taking that grid cell concept that I just mentioned, and we're having to place fuels into those grid cells. And why are we doing that? Because the structure of the forest influences the way the air moves around the fire. It influences the heat transfer from the fire to the fuels and from the fuels back to the air. And it influences the moisture exchange and the reaction rates. So it's important that we capture this three-dimensional structure, and what I've got there shows kind of a two-dimensional, but it's a three-dimensional grid of boxes. So in each grid cell, we end up telling it how much fuel is there and the characteristics of those fuels, such as the size or shape of the fuels and the moisture. Next slide. So one of the things that is powerful about these kinds of models is to be able to back up and rethink paradigms that maybe we've taken for granted in the past. And so the slide here, and Kevin, I'm going to count on you to back up and keep it going if it stops. Slide here shows 3 different slices, horizontal slices through a prescribed fire. We're looking down on the prescribed fire on the 3 images on the right. On the left is a wildfire. And just to give you a little bit of orientation here, the colors are the wind fields in that slice. The blues are upward moving air. The greens are horizontally moving air. And the reds are dropping air. And when you see no color, it just means the wind speed is very low. So what you see in black is you see the progression of a prescribed fire as they light it moving upwind. And so I'd like to bring attention to the difference between the 3 images on the right and the wildfire context on the left. Namely, what are we doing to the aerodynamic drag and the the wind flow around the fire? In a wildfire, as it progresses, we burn out the fuel behind the fire. This allows the wind to get in and drive the fire much more efficiently. Where in a prescribed fire, because we typically light it progressing upwind, we leave that fuel that's upwind and it creates a backward facing step. And so the wind paradigm and the drag and the circulations around a prescribed fire are often quite different than they are in a wildfire. And this is something that's really important, that we be able to capture those effects in our modeling. Go ahead, Kevin. So this leads us to, how do we take what we've done with some of these high fidelity coupled fire atmosphere tools and turn them into things that are useful for practitioners? James Furman ran a project where he was leading an effort to use the high fidelity tools to explore different prescribed fire tactics and different ignition patterns and how those ignition patterns influenced fire behavior and consumption of the canopy, etc. And we learned a lot about what we could do with models. The unfortunate part is, as James will attest, it was really painful because it took us a long time to do all those simulations. And each of those simulations, Kevin said they were a day. It might be 2, 3, 4 days, depending on the length of the simulation. So, and how much we're having to affect the computational queues, which not everybody has access to those resources. So we need a tool that can run on a laptop, let's say. So one avenue to go towards that is QUIC-Fire. And QUIC-Fire is a in-progress tool. And what you'll see later today is demonstrations of where we are today. but I want to emphasize it's in progress. And the name of the game today is how do we get co-production to help guide the rest of that process? So where is it today? It started from learning what we could from the high fidelity simulations such as fire tech about what drives fire behavior, and then coupling it with a fast running wind solver that was actually developed for urban dispersion, putting those together so that it captures all those two-way feedbacks between the fire and the atmosphere and the vegetation structure, both in terms of combustion and heat transfer and its influence on the wind, and putting in that in a package so we're really focusing on that two-way coupling. Go ahead, Kevin. So where we are today, as I mentioned, it's a work in progress that needs your help desperately. We've been doing a lot of exploration on basic phenomenological testing, but there's only so much we can do without input from the co-production community. There's ongoing model development every day. The model's progressing, we're adding new capability, we're realizing things that would be nice to have, and working them in, or refining physics, or sometimes the model breaks on us and we realize we put a bug in. So there's ongoing work. You shouldn't feel like it's a done shrink wrap Microsoft Fire model. So I think the bottom line here is there's a real opportunity for co-production to become a part of the development of this tool.
Thanks, Rod. So for the rest of the day, we're going to really kind of, unpack how we can utilize your expertise and creativity in the further development of QUIC-Fire. And to do that, we're going to go through a few basics about the mindset you got to have in order to sort of think about these coupled fire atmospheric behavior modeling tools. And most firefighters, firelighters do this anyway. They're doing it intuitively on the fire line. I could see Tommy's brain, cranking through the supercomputer calculations as he's thinking through, sort of the blowhole lighting techniques. And so we're going to start by just trying to get our minds wrapped around 3D fuel inputs, winds, ignition patterns, smoke, and wildfires. And that should allow us to really dive into this afternoon's discussion / conversations about, the wildfire models that we've done with the Spring Hill scenario, some prescribed fire planning that we've done, as well as smoke and emissions management. So to start with, we really need to think about what is a fuel. Instead of fuel models, we got to think about vegetation. What Rod showed is that these coupled fire atmospheric behavior modeling tools run at relatively fine scales, 1 to 2 to 4 meters. And the vegetation, fuel as vegetation, needs to be recaptured as part of the mindset that we approach our modeling with. Because vegetation is three-dimensional, and then we bend that vegetation up into these cubes called voxels, we need to be thinking about how fuel is represented, or that vegetation is represented in these cubes, and what scale of cube is needed. What's important for the questions that you're asking, whether it's fire behavior, fire effects, or smoke dispersion. I'm going to back up just a second. And then, what data go into each of those cubes is going to be really, really important. On the right shows just a quick simulation of a 2-dimension or 2-meter scale run of fire behavior on an Eglin unit. So vegetative inputs are really important, and we've got a variety of tools to characterize them, but primarily we're looking at bulk density. Instead of the land fire model of 2 dimensions, we really, and we think of fuel loading, we take the entire forest, crush it down, and get 1 loading per 30 meter pixel. Now we need to be thinking about bulk density per volumes, and fuel moisture per voxel volume, and as well as surface to volume ratios. Now, on that surface fuel later, QUIC-Fire also is going to need a fuel height for the litter, and it can start separating out even some of the patchiness if there's bare ground components. And so there's a lot of opportunity to put variation, which we know is key to fire prediction. The little movie that's playing on the left is a LiDAR scan of a forest at Fish Lake National Forest in Utah. And we can use these LiDAR tools. We can use a variety of other tools to try to represent the three-dimensionality of our vegetation. The terrestrial laser scans like you just saw, or that is depicted here for a longleaf pine, can be used to sort of segment out vegetation from tree boles, and to think about its distribution and the variation of distributions within stands for leaf volume. And as we were looking at some of those pictures of post-fire tree resprouting with the pitch pine, that's going to be really important to think about what the next fire could do and how long it would take for the next fire to really propagate up into the crown, given those kind of chia pet trees that come back after the wildfire. Now, we do have access to a number of tools, modeling tools to represent three-dimensionality, and stand fire is one of the most robust. Russ Parsons at the Rocky Mountain Research Station, as well as trees, which Rod developed and we'll be demonstrating actually later today with the scenarios, to quickly populate and incrementally build complexity into our three-dimensional depictions of vegetation. But again, you got to start thinking in 3D, and these voxels are going to be the sort of the building blocks. It's almost like Minecraft for firefighters. So what else is important about our fuelscapes? Well, roads. As Mike and Tommy's slide showed earlier, the roads have a defined width. Sometimes that width is narrower and does not matter to a rip-snorting wildfire coming at it with 20-mile-an-hour winds. Sometimes, as in the prescribed fire scenario that Rod showed, roads channel wind. They actually help box in, establish flows. And so what you see on the screen is what QUIC-Fire does with wind. Every single voxel, it's accounting for wind velocity and direction at about a 1 second time stamp throughout the simulation. So understanding where fuels aren't is almost as important as understanding where fuels are in predicting fire behavior with these coupled fire atmospheric behavior models. Of course, we also need to think about scaling up. And this is one of the biggest challenges where we are right now, is that because when we're working on small scales, we can actually, quickly develop custom inputs, even for, an area as big as the Spring Hill wildfire. It was, about 2 kilometers by 5 kilometers that we were modeling initially. But how we do this at millions of acres is to be determined. And Landfire, as sort of our national fuels modeling and mapping service, is still thinking in 2 dimensions. They actually have 3-dimensional data behind all of those fuel models. But if we remove fuel models from our thinking and replace them with vegetation, we can put default vegetation on the landscape and represent it for, say, pygmy pitch pine versus, some of the more productive sites, and actually account for that 3-dimensionality that's so important for using coupled fire atmospheric feedbacks. And of course, the scale of the resolution does matter for fire behavior predictions. What we're going to show here is a slide from Daniel Rosales, one of my grad students' theses, and it shows increasing resolution from 2 to 8 to 16, all the way up to just a homogeneous zone. And as we homogenize fuels at the scale, these had the original same inputs. We're just averaging up at larger and larger voxel sizes for the surface fuel layer. When you get to completely homogeneous fuels, you get a much faster moving, smoother fire. Well, as fires add heterogeneity, they break up, they move a little slower, they create pockets, they come together. And if resolution, if say you're just predicting the worst case scenario, maybe the bottom right is just fine. You can use a homogeneous fuel input. Landfire would be roughly equivalent to that 32 meters, but only for the surface. We also have, on top of that 32-meter surface fuel layer in these models, we have a 2-meter depiction of the canopy held constant across these runs. And so again, even if you're homogenizing surface fuels, you have to think about where the trees are in order to capture the vegetative drag that Rod was talking about earlier. One thing that we also want to sort of get your thoughts on is, now we move from 2D to 3D fuel inputs, 2D to 3D fire effects. How do we change our monitoring? How do we change, sort of institutional mindsets as to how we build new fuel inputs or custom fuel inputs for our landscapes? And how do we monitor fire effects? There's 2 really wonderful efforts ongoing, one led by Nick Skoronsky, Mike Gallagher, Scott Potswinski, to define laser-based, low-cost, simple laser-based scans that are co-located with some of the transect plot sampling that you see in the lower left, that allow for people to quickly, within a matter of minutes, inventory a part of their forest in 3 dimensions. And that's what you see coming out of the BLK, like a BLK 360 laser here. It's about $18,000. Still expensive, but if you can do, a point in 2 minutes and combine that with, let's say, some 3-dimensional sampling, which you see on the right, which is Louise Loudermilk's crew, that's sampling bulk densities in these voxels so that we have inputs and distributions of possibilities per forest type. Those kinds of inputs, matching research and 3-dimensionality to monitoring, we really need some creative thinking about how those can be used to scale up and apply, tools like QUIC-Fire more effectively, to meet your needs. So I'd like to also just ask you to think creatively about how you would use these kinds of tools to revolutionize your own prescribed fire planning process. For the first time, I mean, back in the day when we had PC Behave, they had this RX window. You kind of put in the fire behavior wanted, and it would sort of back into what it thought the antecedent parameters should be. But now we can run ensembles. We can run massive combinations of wind speeds, fuel moistures, and ignition patterns, and do it in relatively quick succession with tools like QUIC-Fire. But then it also begs the question: what defines a prescription? If now we know that we can adjust our fire behavior patterns in the models ahead of time, once we exceed a certain energy release rate, or we have see some sort of smoke management patterns that we don't like, how does it change the way we plan for prescribed fires and establish prescription sort of boundaries? And when you think about the old prescription planning process, this is the window. We think of it as wind speed, relative humidity, fuel moisture, and temperature as a bounding condition. And maybe that changes seasonally, maybe not for certain ecosystems. But we have gotten so precise, overly so, with the way that we constrain our prescription parameters. We have those relative humidity, temperature ranges, wind speeds, and fuel moisture. And every time something bad happens, we actually start truncating the decision space for prescribed fire managers. And we just do it kind of ad hoc. And now we got to get a variance to operate outside of that dashed line. And every time we do that, it's a legal document. And so now we're putting ourselves potentially at risk. What if these tools could allow for us to think about prescription and decision space in an expanded way? Well, we just had, say, 2 inches of rain yesterday, and so the surface fuel moisture is still going to be influenced by, soil moisture. Those things are not in current fire behavior models, but could be in a couple fire atmospheric behavior models. We could think about expanding that decision space of managers as a way of increasing fire safely on the landscape. And this is kind of just really quickly to make sure that everybody knows when I say ensemble, this is sort of what happens. We can start doing these wind, we can have wind scenarios, low, medium, high. We could run every mile an hour from 2 to 20 and look at how it interacts with the scale of fuel resolution on your landscape as depicted in these graphics, or the moisture of that fuel on the landscape. And we can even start thinking about how gustiness of the wind field interacts with fire behavior characteristics that you want to manage for. And so these ensemble runs, if you have the ability to run, and Alex Josephson will present this, I think, with Rod or one of the smoke management groups today, you can run thousands of these models if you have enough time. And it doesn't take a ton of time. They do it on the supercomputer in a couple of days. But even on the laptop, we can do these in a few days and run hundreds of simulations. So I wanted to also just make sure that we understood that now in fire behavior modeling and planning, we can represent ignitions, whether it's prescribed fire ignition pattern or even wildfire tactics, with greater resolution than we've ever had before. And this is where it really gets exciting to me. And as we see some of the simulations with the Spring Hill wildfire tactics, as we think about that blowhole strategy that Tommy talked about, what is an ignition pattern? We need to do a better job of defining that so that fire managers can think creatively and accurately when they try to put these couple fire atmospheric models like QUIC-Fire to use. So what is an ignition pattern? We're told, back in flanking head fire, but really is complex. We have lines that vary in their continuity, dots to dashes. Sometimes we're lighting a line and there's a gap in the fuel and it propagates through the grid. We have the number of lines. Do we have 3 igniters? I apologize, this thing's on a timer just to make sure that I don't take too much time, but we have the number of lines. I've seen up to 7 people walk across a unit. We have the rate of line ignition. If it's really open like the picture on the right, you can walk at 2 miles an hour. If you have an ATV, you might be able to go at 4. How fast do you move through the unit? When you get to the other side, how long do you take to come back? So when you repeat the pattern, and how much spacing in between the lines, all of these are now possible to explore as you sort of think about the kinds of fire behavior you expect, or if you're trying to teach a new burn boss what to expect in your particular unit. Winds and wind libraries are going to be concepts that we want to unpack with you as well. So QUIC-Fire can use wind inputs from a variety of sources. We can use the flux towers of Ken Clark up there. We can use weather stations like we did for the Spring Hill fire run, or you can just define it. It could be static or dynamic. You can create, QUIC-Fire is going to create local variability based on the fuels and the vegetation and the roads that you input and the terrain. But we can also use libraries of wind. You can say, hey, what's my average wind speed on a typical prescribed fire day, and be able to pull out, hours and hours of wind data and run that as an ensemble to see what the variation in fire behavior is based on the variety of gusts and flipping and flopping that you get in a natural wind field. And so understanding these, as well as big picture things like density currents, like a thunderstorm, we'll have some of those in simulations, is really important. And those winds are going to propagate into how you think about smoke management with tools like QUIC-Fire. And so current plume models try to model smoke every hour. Well, QUIC-Fire is able to do the emissions calculations every second. That may be too much, but QUIC-Fire can work with those other larger and longer distance dispersion models to hand off emissions that are derived from your your ignition patterns. And so now you can plan my smoke ignition based on the ignition pattern. Here's an aerial ignition on some hurricane blowdown at Tyndall Air Force Base in the simulation. And one of the modeling scenarios this afternoon is going to walk you through how QUIC-Plume works with QUIC-Fire to display the emissions right now. Smoldering fire and smoldering emissions are not yet included, nighttime smoke dispersion, but there's no reason why we can't. And so if that's something that folks want, let's think about that creatively together today. Here is a depiction of a thunderstorm outflow boundary intersecting a fire on relatively flat terrain. It could be a sea breeze front. They operate very similarly. Well, understanding these kinds of wind fields, very complex wind fields that can be derived from tools like FireTech on the supercomputer, we can both pipe those winds into a tool like QUIC-Fire or just test the way that QUIC-Fire behaves to them, because QUIC-Fire and the supercomputer models run the exact same fuels. And so now we can say, if we don't like the simulation or we don't trust it, we can step back into the supercomputer model world and test the assumptions that we've made and see if they held up. And so one of the reasons why one of the test cases that we're going to leverage this afternoon, the reasons why we started here, is that New Jersey has an amazing wildfire potential. And yet it's on flat terrain, so it's a great place to test new tools because we take topography essentially out of the equation, at least in complex ways. And so QUIC-Fire is being used to reconstruct wildfires and to actually test and train on tactics as well. And this is going to be the topic of Daniel's and Zach's presentation this afternoon, a conversation with y'all. And so think about how, if you had these tools in your hands, what could you plan for, in terms of fuel treatment effectiveness, road width, in order to set, blowhole strategy. Could we model ember transport, long distance ember transport? QUIC-Fire already runs on short distance ember transport and flame bathing and energy transfer at the finest scale. But if you could do that, I also want you to think about how you would want those results returned to you. Here's a close-up depiction of a wildfire being modeled by QUIC-Fire on the mountainside just above Los Alamos. How do you want QUIC-Fire, if you had access to the tool, to be displayed when it creates outputs? Just the creativity and really the practicality of output, visualization is going to be something that we really need your help in thinking about. Lastly, I want you to also consider marginal fire. What we're a catch-all term we're using to describe, both backing fire, flanking fire, fire under conditions that may be not the worst case scenario. The reason why they're important is that those crown streets that you saw in the Spring Hill fire run are created by variations in the wind field. And every time you have a wind shift, a flank becomes ahead for a brief moment. If the wind shift is permanent, like on a sea breeze, that flanking fire is going to become ahead. And so if your model captures flanking fire behavior or backing fire behavior, you're going to be more accurate in predicting wind shifts and the consequences of those wind shifts on a prescribed fire or a wildfire scenario. So think about marginal fire and how well you think QUIC-Fire is capturing, say, fuel moisture content and fire behavior under higher fuel moisture contents. How well does QUIC-Fire move fire across gaps in the fuel? Does it meet your sort of intuitive slide set? Is it realistic? And those kinds of co-production validation pieces are really, really critical because every single one of the fire managers on this call is his or her own supercomputer. And ultimately, I threw this in, but we can start to tie, because we've got three-dimensional vegetation, we can tie fire behavior to fire effects. That piece is a little further down the road, but it's one of the real active areas of research for Nick Skoronsky and I. With that, Amanda, I think we're ready to co-produce.
Geez, amen to that, Kevin. I don't have a whole lot to add except a huge thank you to Kevin and Rod for your presentation. Virtual applause, please. Also, thanks again to Mike and Tom for presenting earlier and just setting the stage and giving folks a taste of what fire and fuels in New Jersey look like.